Hello, hello. Get started in just a second here. Hello, hello. All right. Greetings, everyone. So today I will be introducing our next chapter uh, of the rediscovery of meaning, a short chapter called The Meaning of Literal. Short, but it packs a punch, to use a tired metaphor. The meaning of literal. So Barfield is here laying out his theory of language and the evolution of consciousness. And I'm going to offer a frame um, to interpret what Barfield is up to in this chapter, drawing on Alfred North Whitehead and his understanding of the importance of a careful attention to the power of language whenever we're doing metaphysics. And I think it aligns quite well with what Barfield is up to in this chapter. For Whitehead, every special science, whether physics, biology, and so on, has its own instruments that it utilizes in its experiments. And he says that metaphysics, which is kind of the science of science, has its instrument, but in the case of metaphysics, the instrument is language itself. Now, this is, of course, a metaphor because we wouldn't want to mistake language for simply being an instrument. That would be a kind of, um, well, in Barfield's sense, a very positivist understanding of language as a means of communication, of transferring information about the literal states of affairs in the world. Um, and as we'll see, that's a very late achievement of language in Barfield's sense. And so while I think there's something to what Whitehead is saying, that metaphysics is an experimentation upon the instrument of language itself, we need to hold that term instrument lightly, recognizing its metaphorical character, because there's a real danger that, well, in thinking of language as just a tool of communication to transfer literal information about the world from mind to mind, say, that rather than language being the tool, we ourselves become the tool. Language can be, and in fact, in many ways, in our world, has become uh, flattened into, again, just a means of information transfer. Language has become a commodity, a kind of um, used for brand strategy. And language used in that way can capture our attention and manipulate us, right? Such that we're the instrument, we're the tool. And so hold that metaphor lightly. We don't want to mistake language just as a neutral tool for manipulating meaning as though meaning is something out there that's used to designate things in the world. But nonetheless, I think we can recognize what Whitehead is saying here. Um, Metaphysics as experimentation on the instrument of language itself is really to say that when we do metaphysics, we're experimenting on ourselves because language is this bridge between mind and nature, right? Language is a transformative agent. It's the medium of participation. It's not just about communicating information, it's about communion uh, between mind and nature. So Barfield introduces a distinction in this chapter that he borrows from I.A. Richards between vehicle and tenor. The vehicle of meaning would be its literal or surface, the literal or surface meaning of a statement. It's typically sensory, it has to do with the outer world, whereas the tenor has to do with the inner or moral meaning, um, what an expression conveys. And so Barfield uses the neat metaphor that, the typical theory of language nowadays is that um, one could reduce or translate the tenor or the metaphorical meaning of a statement to the literal meaning in the same way that someone could instead of driving in a vehicle to the destination that they're trying to reach, they could get out and walk, right? And so there's this theory of meaning and metaphor that the say the explicationist meaning that any metaphorical meaning could be translated back into its literal meaning, which is to say the tenor can be reduced to the vehicle. The implicationist theory would be that actually there's something about what can be conveyed via the tenor of a statement, the metaphorical meaning, that can't always be reduced. There's something irreducible about symbolic meaning that can't be literalized. So Barfield laments the rise in the 20th century of a kind of logical positivist school of thought that really all meaning, if we wanted to clarify our knowledge of the world, should be reduced and clarify our language. All meaning should be reduced to a kind of logical symbolization where language becomes purely discursive. It represents states of affairs in the world, in the sensory world, and anything abstract, any nouns that refer to something that we can't point to in the physical world is really just a kind of noise that we make, um, akin to a growl or a squeak of some animal, a grunt that we attribute emotional significance to, but that really has no logical significance in that it would point to something real in the world. And metaphor, in this sense, in this positivist view of language, is just a sort of decorative, flowery overlay on the primarily informational function of language to communicate information. Um, Barfield quotes Anatole France here, who thinks that all philosophy, all reference to abstract ideas, is really just again perfected animal cries. There's no it's a verbal illusion, right? So Barfield then, to convey the point he wants to make about uh, the critique of this positivist view of language, he quotes Emerson, who in his essay Nature, and I paraphrase, says that for every word that we use to refer to a moral or intellectual idea can be traced back originally to some material appearance. And so there's one theory of the origin of language that suggests that the history of language is sort of hiding its own origins in a kind of metamorphosis from an originally material vehicle, a literal statement, what Barfield calls born literalness, to a spiritual tenor, to a metaphorical use. And so Barfield tries to suss out what would it mean if this theory of the origin of language and meaning were true, that we begin with literal statements, just sort of a grunt and a point at an entity in the world, and then metaphor comes later as an addition. And so Barfield searched for what an originally material meaning for a word might have meant to the earliest speakers, and he runs into some paradoxes and says that can't possibly be how meaningful language originated. And so he distinguishes between this faulty idea of the evolution of language, um, which he refers to as the specter of born literalness, that language was born in simple literal statements. This is a kind of modern myth that he deconstructs and unveils, where, again, language just begins as plain labels for facts and metaphor comes later as a flourish. And he contrasts this born literalness, this modern myth of the origin of language, to achieved literalness, where actually, and this is Barfield's thesis, literalness is a later achievement, that the capacity to speak literally arrives after this long process of abstraction, whereby the mind removes itself more and more from a nature that now appears to it as separate and reflects upon nature. So literalness is born after consciousness has differentiated from a more participatory engagement, from a sense of communion with the world. And in Barfield's sense, of course, language has a participatory origin. It was born in a time when mind and nature were not yet differentiated, early speech was participatory, and so consciousness and symbolization were correlative, as he puts it. Words were not about things so much as they were a means of communing with things and with others, other minds. So one way that that I would offer, again, drawing on Whitehead again, that we might try to recover this form of communion that language could afford us again. Uh, and Barfield points this out too, is through poetry. And in his book Symbolism, Whitehead talks about the way that typically words symbolize things for us in our normal everyday consciousness nowadays, but that poets can sometimes go for a walk in the woods, and in a fit of ecstasy, it's actually the trees that symbolize the words. And so the usual order reverses, right? In this form of poetic consciousness. The trees begin to symbolize the words, right? And for a reader of a poem to really grasp what the poet is trying to express, there's a need for this double relation, right? It's not just words that symbolize trees, but trees can symbolize words, right? And I think this is an invitation to begin to experience language again as a transformative agent. It's not merely a way of labeling things in the world. It has more than just a literal meaning. We can recover the originally metaphorical meaning of language by engaging poetry in this way. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for your attention and welcome your comments, questions, other insights from this chapter that I didn't mention that you think should be surfaced. Please.
Thanks, Matt. Over here in Switzerland, we went back an hour sooner than y'all. Maybe some others in Europe are experiencing that too. But anyway, thank you for that summary. I just wanted to make a quick comment, just that last one of the last things you said. Words can symbolize trees, and trees can symbolize words. I would say yes, but maybe more, at least like in the history of language, I think it might be more accurate to put it like trees can symbolize ideas, and therefore can give rise to words um, as symbols of concepts or symbols of experience. But anyway, just want to make that comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ashton. Maybe can you unpack a little bit more what shifts when
Well,
you add that third
I
idea,
guess
the word thing?
yeah, an idea or a concept. I mean, we have words for them in different languages, so I guess there's something about the word or the idea or the concept that exceeds the words that can be or the symbols that can be created through language to refer to it. Um, yeah, and so I guess the word is more this like meeting place between the percept and the concept.
Yeah, no, that's important. It makes me think of these two different accounts offered in the 20th century about uh, the meaning of language. Ferdinand de Saussure had this idea of the signifier and the signified, that language could be reduced to that sort of binary, which ultimately means, and this is the structuralist account of language, right, that the meaning of words comes from other words. And so words only point to other words, and we get kind of locked in on this account of semiosis and linguistics, we get locked into a kind of cage of language where meaning is only words pointing to other words. Whereas there's another account of semiosis that comes from Charles Saunders Peirce, where there's a three-way relationship. Semiosis or meaning making always involves not just signifier and signified, but in what he calls an interpretant. This is the subject who's uh, involved always in this triadic relationship of making meaning by bridging sign and object signified. And the object signified could be another concept or it could be a thing in the world. It could have a spiritual meaning or a literal meaning. And so bringing in that three-way Trinitarian relationship, I think, avoids any sense that we get trapped inside of language, because then language can refer outside itself, beyond itself. It has a kind of ecstatic capacity. Um, so I think you bringing in that third term mediating between the tree and the word is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, and it allows for, right, words to change their meanings, but also, but that doesn't have to mean that there's no meaning, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that too.
So I had some thoughts. Matt, I actually got a chance to listen to your recording, which I thought was extremely poetic and inspired my thinking on this. Um, at risk of sounding positivist, I was thinking of Barfield saying literal, and I sort of translated that as a framework of language and metaphorical as a liminal space for interpretive, uh, latching on to what Ashton said, an interpretive meaning between words. And as an example of that, I always look at things in terms of music and math because that's where I come from. And so if you look at music, there's a bunch of symbols on a page if you read music. And that would be the framework. And the symbols can have staccato, they can have legato, they can have crescendos. And even as you're translating them, they still don't quite spell out the piece in the way that you, the player, or the listener would really want to move into a piece of music and participate with it. And so the metaphorical I thought of as the liminal space in between that has a meaning that the composer maybe originally intended, and it's there, but it's not written on the page. It's a sort of a metaphorical. So the player is essentially a translator. And I'm thinking of what Barfield is saying as between literal and metaphorical as a sort of a translation. In terms of mathematical, so mathematics to me, and I have 2 degrees in mathematics, the symbols are sort of temporary placeholders for truths that we know today. And I didn't think about that actually that way until I took your class, Matt. But our truths in mathematics even are evolving. Because we're part of the equation. We can't know the whole equation, but we do need some placeholders. And so the metaphorical in that sense would be our evolution of understanding. And I think in your recording, you were calling it the stream of understanding, if I understood you correctly. So that if we take it back to what Barfield is saying, that we're really part of the language, that it's evolving, and the human is growing and understanding as the language is sort of alive within us as opposed to stagnant. And I think you might have said knowledge becomes prayer if I translated that what you said correctly in your recording. And so there was one other thing that really struck me in this, and it was what Barfield was saying, and I think this relates to what I'm saying. What Barfield was saying about Coleridge. He says, the mind of man is not, as Coleridge put it, a lazy onlooker, but an external world sorry, a lazy onlooker on an external world, but instead a structural component of the world it contemplates. So it's really part of language is part of us, and we are part of language. At least that's the way I'm translating it.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. Glad you liked it. What I posted, I shared a link to what Kat was talking about if you haven't seen it. Just a more elaboration on this chapter. Less of a summary and more of my own um, carrying forward of what Barfield is up to, in my sense.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to just say that I think that the poetic way in which you presented that was it made it translated what Barfield was saying so beautifully, and I hope that um, philosophy's accessible more like that. Thank you for that.
I'll just jump in and say thank you for what you said. It's very impressive. It's curious because I was just looking at the same paragraph that Kat just quoted from because she quoted from the end of the paragraph, but the start of the paragraph is equally of interest. You know, grandfather's saying that we might be able to manipulate nature, but until we accept that nature is the reflected image of man's consciousness and unconsciousness, we won't really truly find our way through. So it's curious that we'd both picked up that very same paragraph there towards the end of the essay. But I mean, I find the conversations, really stimulating and very engaging. But I overall, I had a feeling when I was reading this essay that this is really the core of what grandfather's philosophy is. I just really feel that it kind of defines his beliefs, and I wish I could explain it better or summarize it more. But every essay is really powerful, but this one, also, I kind of struggle to understand it. I just sense that this is the essence of it because when they say grandfather is interested in the evolution of consciousness as displayed through language, this is where he's laying out his case, he's proving his point here. So, thank you for getting us to reread it. And just to say, I don't know if you circulated a page that you just referred to, but I didn't see a reference to that. So, um,
Reflect what Owen just said. Um, this is the funnest essay I think I've ever read. It was a romp, and he must have had a blast writing this thing. It's so brilliant, and it's working on so many levels. And I think of the reflection of his whole worldview in this word pupillary that he uses. So you're going with grandfather, you're going and scrambling and looking up words all the time, right? Because he means them the way they were meant to be used, and his genius of writing in the English language is there's not a par, right? I mean, I can't think of another person who writes an essay form that does it so beautifully. And his love of language is there, but his love of love is there. And
mm,
he insists on using this word, and he sort of says this, he sort of makes this commitment flippantly almost with some sense of humor. I laughed out loud a few times while reading this essay, and he uses the word concomitant, which means essentially what I've referred to before in the idea of the symbol as the thing and the representative of the thing, right? And so the vehicle and the tenor are one thing in a concomitant relationship. And it's beautiful because in not only does this speak to um I love this. If I hope you don't mind if I call him grandfather because it warms my heart to do so. But I love that grandfather um I strives to get the whole of his worldview in a tight little essay like this, and so part of that worldview is a worldview of a worldview of the Christ, right? And so he was obviously committed to that, um, in a different way than his buddy C.S. Lewis, in a very significant way. And this word concomitant comes up as I looked it up. Um, I don't find uh, I don't I don't find myself often using it, but I'm afraid I'm going to be using it now to the in a tiresome way to people around me. Um, but that it's used as to describe the Eucharist, the that the Christ is fully present in both the bread and the wine during the Eucharist, meaning the whole Christ is present in each species, um, uh, due to an due to the inseparability of body and soul and blood and the food we eat and who we are as people. And I think this just supports this idea that grandfather's whole philosophy, his whole worldview, his whole intimacy with the world is wrapped up in this gorgeous and funny essay. I'm gonna go find the quote that made me laugh out loud and get back to you all about that. But thank you, Owen. That was fantastic.
Yeah, Jeff, there's not many other philosophers who make me laugh as much as Barfield does.
It's so funny because any videos of him and his what is his posture, his sort of seeming attitude toward the world seems so dry, right? Seems so, but um, um, he would have been a fun guy to have dinner with.
There's a recording um, of Barfield delivering what became History, Guilt, and Habit, I believe, a short little book where he was originally recording those lectures. And in the Q&A, he was asked, I think the word he was asked to define by somebody was either
Perception. Yeah.
perception. And there's he's asked earnestly, can you please define the word perception? And he pauses for 5 seconds and he says, no, as if to say, look, there's not a simple, you know, discursive, designatory like meaning for any word. And so to ask for a definition after an hour and a half lecture is just, I guess you didn't understand.
Yeah, it turns out that you can't define the word literal in the same kind of way. And in the end, this is it's really interesting that he is unapologetic about using, well, unapologetic is not the right word. He slips in the word spirit as a word that we're going to define, right? And then he sets up the positivists to trip over themselves in the most ridiculous manner because they say they're very much literalist about objects, right? And in the end, they have a notion of spirit that is literalist, and then they will say there's no such thing as it, right? There's no such thing as spirit. Well, no, there isn't literally, like not in the literal sense of object, right? It's the spirit runs in between the vehicle and the tenor. Right? I think of the tenor as that's the soul that's stretched out for the human being, and that the spirit is playfully moving between the vehicle and the tenor.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned C.S. Lewis, that Barfield uses a distinction that Lewis develops, the magistral and the pupillary forms of metaphor, because there is a sense that, Barfield admits some metaphors are consciously constructed, where you can, see how, like scruple, he thinks maybe Cicero actually originally took the Latin for scrupulous, which meant a rock in one's shoe. Uh, and use that to develop a handy metaphor. But the positivist meaning a reductive understanding of language would suggest that all metaphor was consciously created like that. When Barfield is saying that no, much of it emerges from the transformative power of language itself as a mode of communion with nature. Uh, so it's occurring because of this unconscious connection between mind and nature, and that would be the pupillary form of metaphor that we it's a unique expression of meaning that can't be traced back to its literal meaning. And I think here of the incarnation itself as perhaps the consummation of metaphor and the real metaphysical or even Christological import of metaphor, this carrying through of spirit being carried through to matter, matter being carried through to spirit. That's what's at stake here. Can we understand the incarnation? Only if we can understand Barfield's theory of language, um, where myth and history meet and mingle. And really, it's the consummation of meaning. Eucharist, right? What we're eating, but we're also breathing uh, the meaning of this deed that's so important for Lewis, for Barfield, for Tolkien. I think all of the Inklings were struggling to make sense in a contemporary way of what the incarnation was about. And this theory of language has everything to do with the proper relationship to that event.
Yes, and also I think there's an important aspect that he brings in Ernst Cassirer, and there's a piece that he wrote, which is the problem of language for modern philosophy, and Ernst brings in Nicholas of Cusa, right? So maybe it's in the later part of this book by Barfield, but is the sound of speech a part of the meaning? Where is the relationality between sound and word with meaning? Is it the vehicle? Is sound the vehicle with no tenor? What is the relationship?
Hmm.
That's a good question. I feel like it probably might depend on the word and the historical context, but Barfield also in poetic diction, he acknowledges how crucial those elements of language like rhythm and sound are, but he's just like, I'm not going to deal with them. So maybe that's somebody else's task. But yeah, I think
Maybe,
Steiner talks a lot about things like this.
maybe it'd be too literal for him to talk about it. I mean, he uses the word tenor, which suggests tone to me. So maybe that's where it is, right? In the beginning. He also, if correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe I'm seeing this in the word concomitance, but I think he uses the term resonance at some point. At least that's what kept coming to me. There's something that is resonant. Um, I mean, obviously, when we speak, there's a certain resonance, but it's reflecting the resonance in a pupillary kind of way.
In the eurythmy instructions, Steiner specifies spiritual beings connected with the vowels and the consonants. So each language mixes them and creates this verbal experience in its own way. So you could see it as a divine link, between the spiritual and the human through the human being. And poetry, I believe, almost precedes discursive language. Lullabies for children, very, very elementary, the soothing of sound and rhythm, um, the nurturing of the human being and the connection of the human being with the spiritual. I think that's one of the answers to the question about sound.
Yeah, this is
It's
an
just
interesting
gonna,
conversation. It's like, I liken it back to the musical notes that I was bringing earlier, that that what Barfield is saying metaphorical is the liminal space. That is the crescendos or the staccatos or the volume or the tone, and that the poetry is, to me, it seems very musical. And given that Barfield was himself very musical, I always suspect that he was bringing that into his writing, and that there's some translation of music and poetry working together.
I'd like to go back to the conscious unconscious distinction in the human being in relation to nature, and just to start by saying that this, what we just read, this essay, is kind of a homecoming for me. Not that I've ever read this essay before, it's my first time, but the homecoming for me is to the core idea of this essay, which takes me way back to one of the first things I was assigned to read in my Heilkunst medicine training. And the book that I'm going back to is a German author named Thorwald Dethlefsen, whose book called The Healing Power of Illness. In terms of health and human symptomology and everything, is very much expressing the same idea as Barfield, with, between the literal and the metaphorical, and the human symptom, the physical symptom, is, we could say, kind of the literal, but he brings in this much deeper understanding of what health and illness really is, what a symptom is, in this book I'm referring to. And in fact, this author was a therapist in regression therapy, like bringing people back to past lives for the purpose of illuminating their shadow, right? What they still have unresolved from previous lives comes through in their shadow, comes through in the form of health symptoms and things like that. And for me, that was the beginning of my training, and I kind of took that forward into the very practical application of homeopathic medicine and all that we do to heal the physical body, to heal symptoms, but to have this deeper understanding that it's really this much deeper, multiple life reincarnation shadow kind of work. And anyways, all that to say, there's many more implications in all of that. But this essay by Barfield we're reading is, I'm calling, a homecoming, in the sense that all my years of practically experiencing what this looks like in healing work in day-to-day life, bringing it back now and helping me further ground it through Barfield in this philosophical, scientific, conceptual framework. So that adds a lot for me. But as I say, it's just there's a whole lot of coming together for me, rather than kind of a new idea here.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, definitely see the connection with healing and meaning. Michael, I saw you were about to say something a couple times, so I just wanted to.
Thanks very much. I did want to respond to Will's question about sound of speech and meaning, because it also spoke to your comment early on about tree and words. And so building on what Rosemary mentioned from Eurythmy, I've always used the example of the word tree as opposed to, say, baum in French. And it would be, I don't know enough other languages to try, but just to make a point that when I hear the word tree, I feel that our ancestors had to be looking at conifer, evergreen trees, whereas those who looked at baum were looking at deciduous oaks, maples. And I hope that just conveys the different gesture in the sound tree as opposed to the gesture of baum, and that one can make some connection to then the different gestures of various trees. And so just with that example, I do think that we could actually find a practical way initially into this word tenor. Kind of, yeah, we all get the meaning of it, but I would like to introduce the word quality, that we are so bound by quantitative attributes that belong to the physical nature of reality. But that's where, as an artist, sculptor, and painter, I have concerned myself a great deal with the qualities of color and form, but also, for example, speech and movement and of tone, of music, as really a stepping stone, a starting point for actually cultivating what Barfield calls final, or I prefer conscious, regained participation. And in fact, I would just, as then the octave of original participation, I do really think that before words, there were sounds, yeah, that our most ancient ancestors, the reality of speech sounds was a spiritual formative force, so that when they looked at a tree, that's what they experienced, not the leaves and other physical attributes that we might as modern people, but they really experienced, I'll call it spiritual forces of treeness, as opposed to boundness. That's where there are different attributes of trees, and so they might have emphasized one over the other. But it just is an important, I think, link. This qualities of sounds, but the qualities of all sense phenomena are maybe one way we can understand what original participation was like, and how that might be cultivated now consciously as a way to regain a participatory consciousness.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Michael. Maybe Will wants to respond, but I just wanted to emphasize what you're saying about, inspired by what Will brought up, sound. Uh, Nowadays, for our alienated consciousness, um, we can distinguish between noise and meaningful sound, whereas in original participation, there was no noise. Everything was meaningful. Sound immediately conveyed an emotional quality, uh, at the very least. And it's only in our time when, I'm here in downtown Oakland and I hear automobiles driving by, and we have a concept of noise now, which is not meaningful sound. I mean, it's meaningful in the sense that, oh yeah, I know that's a car, but it doesn't convey uh, a deep meaning that we would nowadays call metaphorical. Whereas I think what we usually mean by metaphor today, as conveying a kind of symbolic meaning, all sound, even for a pre-linguistic people that were still singing to each other, and didn't have what we would nowadays think of as a language set apart from just their way of being in an active resonance with the natural world around them. Um, all sound for them was immediately perceived as meaningful, right? And they would have been hearing the calls of other animals, the wind through the leaves of trees, and all of that for them was, yeah, immediately perceived as what we would again call spiritual, right? But it's just as natural as it is spiritual in that original form of participation.
I might just add that also, and it was not just personal. Yeah, it was not a question of I like a conifer tree and not a deciduous tree, or I like this color or that. It was an objective phenomena, but which we have to work very hard to regain the objectivity towards this realm of qualities.
But music conveys this well. It's just pure emotion, right?
Yep. Yep.
So we can still engage that participatory form of consciousness through music, I think. Shaunak, I see you've had your hand up for.
Okay. I'm not like technically sound, so thanks for your patience. I want to honor the topic, um, and I want to honor also the recording Matt made, which was referred to earlier, because it is, I think, something special. Kind of my heart sinks a little bit around this. I've been waiting a long time for these kind of conversations to be quote unquote academic. So one of the things I think that's important is that moving away from literalism and fixed definitions, is movement towards conceptual flex. And that is in my estimation, a preliminary step towards living thinking and the philosophy of freedom and practice. So I think this is incredibly vital topic. I feel like Steiner and the philosophy of freedom tried very hard to move literalism in another way, to move the words in another way through the motions of thoughts he used, but he didn't dare to quite be poetical for a lot of reasons, probably good reasons, but at the same time, it never really got picked up in the way that he hoped during his time. And so I think that it, one of the reasons is that we feel there's a lack of solidity if we move off definitions. There's a feeling that because of a positivism, there's a feeling that you won't understand my meaning. And then there's a nod to Barfield with speaker's meaning. Um, there's a feeling that there isn't a spiritual or transpersonal world that connects our thoughts beyond the definition of the word. So that is one of the reasons I think we rely on literalism. And there's a cute story that Wittgenstein, who like tried to live his philosophy famously, right? There would be like logical positivist circles kind of in his honor, and the reports are that he would turn his back and read Tagore to them when it was his turn to speak, just to understand where he felt the limits of literalism kind of ended. And you get the sense in Matt's recording, and I don't want to speak for Matt, but you get the sense he's standing behind his words, right? We're not talking about, we're talking with. And that is to me somehow the crucial turn that goes on here. And there's a Steiner verse that I'm not going to remember by heart, but it's kind of floating around the zeitgeist that really speaks to this so well. So it goes, to one who understands the sense of speech, the world unveils its image form. To one who listens to the soul of speech, the world unfolds its true being. To one who lives in the spirit depths of speech, the world gives freely wisdom's strength. To one who lovingly can dwell on speech, speech will accord its inner might. So I will turn my heart and mind towards the soul and spirit of words. And in love for them, I will feel myself complete and whole. So in that small passage, he's actually moving through imagination, inspiration, intuition to receptive will in just a small space with the word. And if you have an opportunity to stand behind your words in that sense, you really have an opportunity to have your words meet you and to truly feel complete and whole and kind of, in a sense, find your way in the universe, so to speak. So that's why I'm so excited about this presentation. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate that.
I'd like to return for a moment to something that stayed with me from last time toward the end when Rosemary reflected that Barfield would be, or grandfather, I appreciated that from Jeff and Owen sharing this love. When Rosemary mentioned that she imagined, I thought that Owen Barfield would be pleased by the way our discussion flowed into a kind of literary discussion. And I don't know much about the Inklings, but just now as we were talking, I mean, my background is in second language acquisition and world language and English as a new language in kindergarten through 12th grade schools. Um, so what I learned was that babies, human babies, can produce sounds from all of the languages, but our structure of the brain pairs them out, deselects ones that aren't being enervated, used. So this is why it was so difficult for me to attempt to learn Chinese in my 20s. I gave up because of the tones mostly. But so thinking about this Eucharist of full participation in a co-evolving universe and planet, it really appeals to me, this sense of humans' language, speech, the domain of speech and the domain of writing are very different, but they're both expressive. So trees can also create a mood, which brings me back to this thought of the eco-poetics or mythopoetic invitations. So I was curious, Rosemary, I see you smiling. I was curious to think back about how human language as a technology that evolved when we became bipedal needed to survive tigers. And it pops, language pops when we form into social groups. So now language is certainly weaponized. But rather than going toward that, I'd like to think about how this layer of abstraction that language is. So it's kind of meta. We're trying to talk about it and the world by using it. So there's certain layers of abstraction, and I'm curious to know more about literary discussion and the tools of it. Thanks.
Well, it's vast and complex. Matt brought in Pierce and semiotics. Linguistics became sort of a calculative tool for anthropology at one point. But I liked the view of Wittgenstein turning his back on the audience, because Wittgenstein was sort of in that camp and he evolved out of it in his lifetime. And I was just thinking, this essay was published in 60, and that was kind of just at the beginning of the structuralist. And then we have all of the French deconstructionists to follow. And people in English departments were having a tough time with that kind of mental demands on them. I had already finished my degree by 70, so I was out of it. I could study on my own. But I feel Barfield is comfortably out of the fray. You know, he kind of transcends that, and that's why he's such a useful guide in carrying language, speech, spiritual connections forward in a new way. And I know that you have a project going on about Barfield and Whitehead, and I feel like Whitehead is another person who kind of he wasn't identified with the fray. You know, he was always evolving and sharing his ever evolving way of all of his beautiful language that he brought in. I appreciated that about Whitehead as much as I appreciated Barfield's wonderful display of language that Jeff was so pumped up about.
I have a small observation that I'd like to share. This text and listening to this conversation, which is, I mean, it's a single word that is strangely missing, but perhaps for good reasons. But the word communication is almost not present. I don't think that Barfield uses the term communication anywhere in this text. And I mean, I think it's very much, it seems like he's very much focusing on our relationship to the world. But I think there's something in what Shaunak was talking about, this talking with rather than talking to, yeah, it's a strange thing that communication is absent in this discussion about the origin of language. Communication with fellow beings, and but I guess it's there anyway in the sense that when we think about original participation, we think of a world that's conceived as being alive. So any kind of interaction is a communication with other living beings. So yeah, I'm just a little puzzled by the fact that I mean, I've heard the word communion mentioned, but not communication. I think, in my understanding, the origin of language must somehow be the desire of one living being to communicate with another living being. So if you take something like the animal's cry of anxiety, say when it's attacked by a predator, it seems to me that's the, in a sense, the origin of prayer. It's trying to commune, it's trying to call upon somebody else to help the threatened creature in this situation. Even if there are physical is no one around, so it's not necessarily a cry out for other physical beings, but it's, in a sense, it's the origin of spirituality. It's the origin of this longing for something coming to my help, which is later on cultivated in prayer, for example. So yeah, I'm a little confused. I'm not sure what I want to say with this little talk, but I just noticed the absence of this word concept communication in the conversation and in Barfield's writing.
Yeah, interesting point, Karsten. I think during my summary of the chapter, I was distinguishing between the sense of language being primarily about communicating information from one mind to another, and contrasting that with a sense of communion or almost shared resonance. And there's another set of terms, the denotative meaning and the connotative meaning of something to connote. I mean, it's similar to vehicle and tenor, I suppose, where the risk with a word like communication is we think that there's some sort of abstract literal information that we're sending from one person to another, which just implies a kind of separation between observer and observed, mind and nature, and so on. Whereas communion seems to, like the term connote, rather than denote. There's a shared resonance, not only between minds, but between minds and nature, that I think gets lost in our usual sense of communication. And there's almost, I mean, who was it? Lisa saying that language has become a weapon today. I mean, even the term communication has this root munition in it. And so, where did this metaphor originate? How is it that something so significant for producing shared meaning, a word like communication, also has the root of armaments, munitions in it? Like, what is that connection about? I don't think we have time today to trace that out, but interesting point you're drawing to our attention, Karsten.
But I guess the problem with literalism is that it translates the world into a world of things, basically, and
Mm.
also other beings, other living beings to just things. But I think also, I mean, we're talking about the meaning crisis, but what we also should be addressing, and somebody, of course, is the fact that we've lost our ability to communicate, whatever that means, across differences of opinion. I mean, we're living in a world where this ability is missing more than ever, I think.
Mm.
Can I just say, I think it depends on our attention, where our attention is and what our intention is, whether it's to draw a line, which I think of in terms of definitions, or offer a bridge like a description.
Mm. Yeah. Jeff, did you want the last word?
Atonement.
Mm. Hmm. Atonement, attunement. Mm. All right, friends. We'll have to leave it there. See you again in 2 weeks for the next chapter, which is poetic diction and legal fiction.
Hmm. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's great.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.